Today, we are doing the canceled Disney and Pixar movie Iceberg. And if you're not familiar with the Iceberg format, let me tell you a little bit about it. This is when you take some subject and you go deep down a rabbit hole of like stories and rumors and things that people may not know about. Above the surface of water are things that a lot of people know about. But the deeper you go, the less common the subjects are. We are starting off at the top of the iceberg with Newt. So Newt actually gets announced at an April 2008 New York press conference for Disney. What happens when the last remaining male and female blue-footed newts on the planet are forced together by science to save the species and they can't stand each other? So this gets announced in April of 2008, and we actually have quite a bit of footage here. So you do have music from the movie playing right now. So lots of concept stuff is out for Newt. Felt like it got a lot of development time. A lot of it has been released. Unfortunately, at the same press conference 2 years later, nothing was shared about Newt. So there's no updates given. It had been added to the Disney A to Z encyclopedia, and then it got removed. In a 2014 interview, Edwin Catmull shared that it just wasn't working in the pre-production phase. It got passed on to Pete Docter. You may know that name. Pete Docter worked on Monsters, Inc. and Up, and instead, Pete Docter pitched an idea to Pixar that they liked more, which ended up being Inside Out. One of the sort of alleged reasons that this story doesn't work is that around the same time, a movie by the name of Rio came out. And if you are familiar with the movie Rio, yeah, it sort of sounds like exactly the same story. That might also be a reason why this movie didn't work. All right, so moving on from Newt, we get to Gigantic, another one that a lot of people know about because actually it was announced at D23. This made it to the 2015 D23 stage. This was supposed to be set in Spain during the Age of Exploration, and it was going to be Disney's take on the Jack and the Beanstalk story. Jack was going to discover that there was a world of giants hidden above the clouds, and he was going to befriend a giant by the name of Enma, who was said to be 11 years old and 60 feet tall. And Enma was supposed to constantly treat Jack like a doll. The world building that they laid out at D23 was that in the world of the film, humans and the giants had come to an agreement that the giants would keep danger away for the humans and the humans would work for them and give them food and give them livestock. But then the humans were getting fed up with this. They didn't want to keep giving their stuff away to the giants. Eventually that leads to the confrontation, and Jack befriends one of the giants, and that changes the dynamic. They must have felt pretty confident about it because it actually got teased in Zootopia. But unfortunately at D23 2017, there was no updates on Gigantic. It wasn't mentioned at all. And then shortly after that, Disney announced that it had been canceled. The only sort of speculations are that either they were having a hard time making the movie long enough, or that there were creative differences. Next, we have the Toy Story Black Friday reel. This reel, which I am going to show you, allegedly came about because Katzenberg had a desire for Toy Story to have more, quote, edge. There was a reel that got shared in November of 1993.
I'd just like to wish you luck. I know you'd do the same for me.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Whoa! Whoa!
What? What are you, what's everybody looking at? What? Hey, he slipped. I tried to, I couldn't hold that. It was he slipped. Hey, I don't see him. I think he fell onto the street.
He ain't going to pizza now.
Woody, you deliberately threw Buzz out the window.
Hey, it's a toy world.
Toy world.
Cowboy, where is your honor, dirtbag? Men, search and rescue. I want a medevac team on the double. Hustle up. Move it.
Wow.
Hey, spuds for brains. Off the bed. Off the bed!
You gonna make us, Woody?
No. He is. Slinky! Slinky! Get up here and do your job! Are you deaf? I said take care of them!
I'm sorry, Woody, but I have to agree with them. I don't think what you did was right.
Am I hearing correctly? You don't think I was right. Who said your job was to think, Spring Wiener?
Well, I just thought that
use
you...
this vast reserve of brain power to consider this for a moment. If it wasn't for me, Andy wouldn't pay any attention to you at all. In fact, my stretchy friend, you would have been hauled away to Goodwill a long time ago, so shut your mouth and get them off the bed. Do it. Now, Slink, or I'm throwing you off.
You're gonna have to throw the two of us off.
Make that 3.
Are you threatening me?
Yeah. Get off the bed, ranch hand, and we're throwing you off.
Ranch hand.
You and what army?
Here he is, that dirtbag! Frag him! Move, move, move! Take
That was
no
a good setup.
prisoners!
2! Stop! Don't throw him off the bed!
Yeah.
Throw him out the window like he did to Buzz!
Everyone in the room hated that. I can't imagine why. Tom Hanks also made it clear that he really hated portraying Woody this way, and this led to Toy Story nearly being completely shut down. They were going to kill the whole project based on this reel being shared, but the team working on it requested 2 weeks to make the movie they actually wanted to make, not this, quote, edgier version, and in the 2 weeks, they fixed Toy Story, and we got the movie that we ended up getting. Next up, we have Kingdom of the Sun. If you are not familiar with Kingdom of the Sun, and sometimes Kingdom in the Sun, depending on what part of the project this is, this was originally scheduled for a summer of 2000 release date, and this project would go on to be retooled to be Emperor's New Groove. It has a lot in common with Emperor's New Groove, like a lot of the characters. However, at the time, it was actually a Prince and the Pauper story, where Emperor, definitely not Cusco, Manco, swapped place with a llama herder by the name of Pacha. It's a familiar name because they look the same. They had uncanny resemblance. Manco wanted a easier life. He was tired of being an emperor. Pacha thought being an emperor would be cool. It's just the Prince and the Pauper. Then when Pacha went back to being the emperor, Nina, who was Manco's fiance, actually fell in love with Pacha, not knowing it wasn't Manco. And then Yzma, pictured here, found out about the switch and worked with a dark god named Supe to turn Pacha into a llama. See, things are similar, but not exactly the same. She turned Pacha into a llama, but the llama couldn't speak. And then she covered the empire in darkness, and she took over the throne. Also, by the way, Yzma had sidekicks. They were 3 mummies. They were named Mick, Bowie, and Lemmy, rock fans out there, and there was no Kronk, imagine. There is, however, a grumpy anthropomorphic talisman named Waka, I guess. Ultimately, Pachamanco and Nina fight off the dark god and Yzma, and they save the empire. But if you want to know more, it's all out there. We've made it to layer 2, everybody. So I'm going to start with Circle 7 animation. In January of 2004, Steve Jobs actually announced that Disney had decided to not re-up their contract with Pixar. So at the time, Disney doesn't own Pixar because Eisner thought that Disney could just produce sequels to Pixar movies that were as good as, if not better, than what Pixar could do. And so they kill the contract, and Eisner spins up a brand new studio called Circle 7 Animation, and their purpose was to produce sequels to movies that Pixar had made. The end of this story, I'm going to jump ahead, is ultimately that Eisner gets pushed out, and when Iger takes over, he buys Pixar, and then they close Circle 7. The good news is that about 80% of the Circle 7 employees went on to work at Feature Animation. Again, I want to clarify the timeline here. In January of 2004, they announced they're not going to re-up the Pixar contract. In May of 2006, they buy Pixar. So this whole thing got spun up, and these projects got spun up and started, and everything happens in like 2 years' time. So that's the context you need, because the next 3 projects I'm going to talk about are all Circle 7 projects, starting with Toy Story 3. You may know Toy Story 3. Perhaps you're like, Max, that's not a canceled movie. That movie happened. No, this is the Circle 7 version of Toy Story 3. Buzz starts to malfunction, and so Andy's mom sends him to a factory in Taipei where he was made so that he could get repaired. But while he's like in transit or when he gets there, a worldwide recall of Buzz Lightyear figures goes into effect. And so he's no longer going to get repaired. He's just going to get replaced. They're going to send a new Buzz Lightyear back. And so the toys all ship themselves to Taipei to save Buzz Lightyear. I was reading this and I need you to know that there was a piece that stuck out to me. Perhaps you'll figure out why. Meanwhile, the mother pushing the stroller takes her son to a daycare center on the top floor of the Taipei 101, the tallest building in the world at the time. There, Woody and the gang are discovered by other children and are played with in wild and rough ways. Bullseye is made to look like a My Little Pony doll. Mr. Potato Head is stripped of his body parts. Rex and Ham are diapered and treated like babies. Now, I don't know if you've seen Toy Story 3, but boy, does it sound kind of familiar. So, ultimately, Pixar gets bought, and this version of Toy Story 3 doesn't happen, but there are some story beats that feel pretty similar. I just want to call out that, if you look at the concept art of this stuff, it looks just a little wrong because it's not done by Pixar. In the top left, that's them making an escape from the daycare center, and then the bottom right, obviously, Potato Head and Ham have been dressed up. But it looks, kind of. It kind of looks like them. Our second Circle 3 studio is Monsters, Inc. 2 Lost in Scaradise. Now, you may say again, Max, we've seen a second Monsters, Inc. movie, although it was a prequel. This was a sequel film. The story of this one is that 1 year, specifically, 1 year after the first film, Mike and Sully decide to visit Boo. They're missing Boo. There's things going on in their world. I believe I read that Mike was actually getting ready for his wedding to Celia. And so they decide they need a trip and they go to take Boo a birthday present. But as they enter Boo's door, they spot an old woman sleeping in her bed. Originally, when I read about this, what I read was time works different in the monster realm. But that's not true. The intention was not that this was Boo. It was that Boo had moved away. So they find out that Boo moved, and then they have to they go on a quest in the human world to find Boo. And then I have one more, which is Finding Nemo 2. This is the last of the Circle 7 pieces. Now, I don't have any concept art for this one, unfortunately. Finding Nemo 2 would have focused on Nemo reuniting with his long-lost twin brother, Remy. Marlin then gets captured and sent to the aquarium Planet Blue. So Nemo, Dory, and Remy have to go rescue him. Now hold on just a minute. Nemo's long-lost twin brother, a rat. Allegedly, all three of these full scripts are on the internet. So if you're interested, have fun. All right, let's move on from Circle 7. Next up, Chicken Little 2. This was meant to be a sequel to 2005's Chicken Little. There is a story artist, Todd Carter, who worked on this sequel and who's done a couple interviews. He described the plot as Chicken Little finds himself in a love triangle between Abby Ugly Duckling Mallard and an attractive newcomer named Raphael, the French sheep. Carter said that the production and screenings were going pretty well, but that he believes it was canceled because the executives weren't confident that it would perform very well. I know what you've always been looking forward to was the love triangle story of a chicken, a duck, and a sheep. But unfortunately on this day, it just didn't happen. Next up, we have Dumbo 2. Now, this is actually pretty interesting because this was scheduled to be released in 2001. A cool 60 years after the original Dumbo. And once again, they were so confident that this movie was going to happen that a trailer for it was actually on the 2001 VHS and DVD release of Dumbo. If you bought the 60th anniversary edition of Dumbo, this trailer's on it.
We're basically continuing our story as if a day or so after the original.
The kids accidentally get themselves disconnected from the rest of the circus, and they end up in the big city.
They want to have this freedom, but they also have to try to figure out how they're going to get back home.
The storyline and everything, where we're going, it will be all new, but I think it'll have the same flavor and feeling of the old version.
The story's about friendship and parental love, and that there truly is no place like home.
Coming soon from Walt Disney Pictures, Dumbo 2. Premiering on Disney DVD and video.
Ultimately, this got delayed for years and years and years, and then it was just canceled. Oh, and chat, now it's my favorite thing. There are moments in reading about these where you discover things that make you just so giddy. Not because of the idea, but because I get to share it with you. And Roger Rabbit 2 is one of them. Roger Rabbit was a planned prequel to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It was supposed to focus on sort of where Roger came from and getting to Hollywood. But the script takes place from 1941 to 1943. And Steven Spielberg refused to sign on to the film due to its cartoonish depiction of Nazis. Just drink that in for a second. This film is set during World War II. Roger Rabbit, we find him living with a human family, the Randalls, and he learns that they are not his real family. What? He wasn't a cartoon rabbit born of humans? But he decides to go out into the world to find his birth mother. And along the way, he runs into a new friend, Richie, who's heading out to Hollywood. He wants to make it big as an actor, and they go to Hollywood together. And once in Hollywood, Richie and Roger meet two women. One is a human named Wendy Rowan and a toon named Jessica Krupnik. Okay, and they work as radio performers. And that is an important detail. Now I'm gonna skip ahead. To make matters worse, Jessica and Wendy learn that their boss at the radio station, Otto Green, is in fact in league with the Nazis, who kidnaps them and takes them to Germany, where he enslaves Jessica as a propagandist, using Wendy as a bargaining chip. The American government then decides that the way they're going to win the war is that they're going to take cartoons and they're going to put them on the battlefield, because cartoons are not able to be harmed. And so they're going to have an indestructible army made of cartoons. And they're going to take Roger Rabbit and enlist him in the battle to fight the Nazis. But hilarity ensues, chat, when they realize that the cartoons are more interested in gags and entertainment on the battlefield, and they're not really that good for fighting. That got killed. But I will tell you that in the late 90s, this prequel idea was again resurfaced, this time with way less Nazis. This time it was renamed Who Discovered Roger Rabbit, and it was focused on how Roger got work in Broadway and in Hollywood. It would have still done a mixture of live action animation, but this time with CGI animation, and a leak of the pitch actually came out. So what do you think, big fella? I mean, it looks great. You got to give him credit on that one. Scripts for both of these versions are online. All right, we're on to layer 3 of our iceberg. And we're starting off with King of the Elves. Actually, earlier I showed you a 2008 press conference report where Newt was announced. In the same press conference report, King of the Elves is announced. King of the Elves was targeted at a Christmas of 2012 release date, and this was going to take Philip K. Dick's short story and be the basis for a fantastic and imaginative tale about an average man living in the Mississippi Delta, whose reluctant actions to help a desperate band of elves leads them to name him their new king. Joining the innocent and endangered elves as they attempt to escape from an evil and menacing troll, their unlikely new leader finds himself caught on a journey filled with unimaginable dangers and a chance to bring real meaning back to his own life. It's beautiful, man. So that press conference comes out in 2008. In December of 2009, the film was reported as shelved. In 2010, it came back and was back into being developed, but eventually production stalled and the director that was attached to it moved on to working on other things. I have no idea if this animation is actually King of the Elves, but it looks like the right kind of thing, and this is really beautiful. So regardless, just enjoy this because, man, it's just so creative. Such a cute little creature. And then, the flight is wonderful. And the way they just disappear. Oh, it's so cool. Next up is My Peoples. This one does hit pretty close to home because My Peoples was to have told the story of two feuding families, the Harpers and the McGees, whose two children, Elgin and Rose, fall in love. And Elgin was to have dabbled in folk art, creating dolls from various household objects. This is 100% inspired by the Hatfields and the McCoys. In fact, There's even a part of the story about a pig being stolen, which is one of the stories about the Hatfields and the McCoys. I also liked this line: wishing that Elgin would forget about his daughter, Old Man McGee concocted a batch of his late mother's Blue Moon brew, intending to erase Elgin's memory. The brew, however, accidentally brought the dolls to life. So now I'm gonna share with you the dolls. All right, first up we have Angel. Reportedly, by the way, Dolly Parton was attached to the role of Angel to voice her. Angel was a, quote, heaven-themed doll that was made from a flower scoop that Elgin created as a proposal gift for Rose. Then we have Miss Spinster, who had Lily Tomlin attached to her. There was an old lady doll made from the wooden leg of Elgin's dear departed aunt. You know, just taking your aunt's leg, making her into a doll. Then we got Abe. Now, Abe was Abraham Lincoln. He was made from a scrub brush and had spoons for ears. Then we've got Cherokee. This is a Native American doll fashioned out of a garden glove. Then we got Good Old Boy. This is a hillbilly type doll made from parts of a car. And Blues Man. This is a doll with the mannerisms of a blues musician, constructed from the handle of a broken mandolin. But Chad, I'm not done, because last but not least, I've got Crazy Ray, who is described as a convict-themed doll made from a tree stump that lived under Elgin's porch. A convict-themed doll. This movie does have a hell of a story to it. At one point, Cook, who was developing the movie, took a research trip to the Appalachian Mountains. He was hearing a bunch of ghost stories while he was there, and so he gave the film a slight rewrite so that instead of being brought to life by Shine, the dolls were possessed by the deceased relatives of Elgin, and then due to this, the title actually got changed to A Few Good Ghosts. Now, unfortunately, chat, this movie was canceled in favor of Chicken Little. You're gonna hear Chicken Little come up a couple times. So this was being developed out of MGM Studios here in Orlando, and shortly after this film was canceled, the Florida Animation Studio was spun down, which led to Cook, the writer of this, to go get a different job, which ultimately killed the project.
Long ago, about 1811, in a little green valley this side of heaven, on the banks of a river, peaceful and free, lived the Harpers and McGees. I don't know what happened that fateful night, but it all ended up in a terrible fight. A whirlwind feud left them tattered and torn, but in the middle of the fire, true love was born. Tender hearts, young and free, you can't stop love that's meant to be. When the McGee's new chicken laid a strange blue egg, they all gathered round and the old man said, "It's a sign, it's a curse," he cried to his kin. "This shameful romance must come to an end. Ain't it such a mystery? When boy meets girl, it's plain to see. Tender hearts, young and free, you can't stop love that's meant to be." But you know how the youngest didn't listen. True love meant more than a silly superstition. Some say they ran off together that night, but our death's door flew open and they vanished clean out of sight. Ain't it such a mystery? When boy meets girl, it's plain to see. Tender hearts, young and free, you can't stop love that's meant to be. You can't stop love that's meant to be.
Somebody in chat said, and that chicken was Chicken Little. Now, this work would not totally go to waste, because fast forward to Meet the Robinsons, and in the Rejected Inventions room, if you look hard, right past the bowler hat, Good Old Boy and Cherokee are right here, and Angel is back here. And I'm gonna give you a little teaser here. You're gonna see this picture again, because there's someone else we're gonna talk about that is also in this frame from a different canceled film. All right, next up we have Don Quixote. Don Quixote went on to be basically like a cursed project for Disney. This story starts in 1932. In 1939, Disney is looking deeply to find stories that they can make into feature films. They're in Grimm's fairy tales, they're with Hans Christian Andersen's work, and story reader by the name of Diana March is reading all these stories and finds the story of Don Quixote and thinks there's something here. Now the book, if you're not familiar, it's like 1,000 pages long, right? So Diana March takes the 1,000-page story of Don Quixote and creates a 125-page summary of what it could look like as a Disney movie. And they explored this. They actually had an Ecuadorian artist come and do work on like what this could look like and all of this concept work. But ultimately, the story got put on hold because they were having a hard time with the script, right? They just couldn't work it out. Also, they were having a tough time because the artist, Eduardo Solo Franco, painted in this really like beautiful watercolor style, and they weren't really sure how they were going to animate it and like keep what makes it so beautiful, but make it clear and easy to read. So they shelved the project. That's 1939. So it gets revived in the early 1940s, but due to Fantasia flopping at the box office and Disney losing their overseas market because of World War II, it ultimately gets canceled. Then it gets revived again in 1946. This time, Joe Marsh takes the lead. If you're familiar, during the 40s, we got a bunch of anthology films, right? Like Make My Music, Melody Time, that featured a bunch of short works instead of full feature-length films. And so they thought about maybe taking Don Quixote and making it into one of those shorts that would be part of one of those anthologies, right? It's not really clear why it was canceled, but Joe Marsh, who was leading the effort, left a year after he took it on. Then it gets revived again in the 1950s. This time, they were exploring making it a live action film. They had just done Treasure Island, and so Walt Disney was exploring, what if we made Don Quixote into our next live action? They wanted to make Cary Grant into Don Quixote. Unfortunately, Alice in Wonderland bombed, and so they didn't have any money, and so they kill live action Don Quixote. Then it gets put on hold for decades, but it comes back in the 90s when the Brizzi brothers, they had an animation company, Disney purchased them. They are really famous for having done the opening sequence of Hunchback, and they were dead set on being the ones to bring Don Quixote to life. However, there was reluctance to release it because of how Hunchback was received, and so they didn't really want to do another classical novel, and so Eisner killed Don Quixote. Then it comes back again in 2012. This time, another live action, but with a modern retelling. They describe this as having an idea where CIA agents are retired, they have their minds scrambled. And so they were going to make basically the knight character, Don Quixote, into a CIA agent. But the writers who were working on this had an executive contact at Disney. That person left the company. They lost their contact. The project died. Then again, it comes back. In 2016, this time allegedly a script is sold to Disney for a live action that's supposed to be sort of pseudo Pirates of the Caribbean. It's set in the 1600s, but with that kind of like pirates flair to it. This one has been disputed, or claims that this isn't actually real. But all I will say is that maybe eventually we'll see a Don Quixote movie. But it's maybe time to let it go. All right, next we have Toy Story 2. I don't really have anything for you here. All I have to tell you is that originally Toy Story 2 was going to be a direct-to-video release, and it was going to be 60 minutes long, but they shared some of the reels in November of 1997. The executives were so pleased with it that they asked them to expand it, make it into a 90-minute feature-length film, and so the direct-to-video version was killed, and the version that we got ultimately was created. I will just note that reportedly, Jessie wasn't in the direct-to-video version, so Molly probably is sad that it didn't happen. Then we have Snow White Returns. Oh man, another one that I'm so excited to talk about. Earlier, I talked about how Dumbo with the Diamond, the 60th anniversary, teased Dumbo 2. Apparently, this is a trend, because with the Diamond edition of Snow White, this was discussed. Don Hahn actually discussed the Snow White Returns story sketches.
Hi, I'm Don Hahn, the producer of Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King, and I'm here at Disney's Animation Research Library, where researchers from all over the world come to study the artwork and the documents that we create in the making of Disney animated films. Today I want to share with you what we think is an absolutely remarkable discovery. In the process of doing research for this Diamond edition of Snow White, a really unique piece of Snow White history was uncovered. It was in this box that there was a folder that contained a small bunch of story sketches, the first of which said, Snow White Returns. Further investigation led to finding more story sketches, enough to see the arc of a storyline. Sequel to Snow White? Could it possibly be? A press release from the Disney studio prior to the completion of Snow White relates that the artists working on the film were so convinced of the appeal of their characters that they were begging Walt to put these newly created characters into upcoming productions.
You know, I just want to note, I don't know what the line dwarf creators seek lasting fame for brain children means. I'm sure it means something, but it's a hell of a sentence.
Created characters into upcoming productions. So what about these story sketches for Snow White Returns? When were they created? Why were they made? A very likely theory is that these story sketches for Snow White Returns were created after the movie was released, and that it was probably intended to be a short rather than a full-length animated feature. We do know that following the amazing success of Snow White, that there was a great demand from the viewing public for more cartoons with the dwarves. But we also know that 2 major sequences that were developed for Snow White were deleted from the final film. These 2 sequences happen to figure really prominently in the story outlined by these newly discovered images. The soup eating sequence was dropped from Snow White in November of 1937. Walt cut it even though he loved it because he felt like it just slowed down the story. The bed building sequence was the second deleted scene. This sequence is a series of gags as each of the dwarves and some of their animal helpers build parts of the bed in their own unique ways.
As they say, like, part of the discussion around this topic is that, yeah, they were trying to use cutting room floor pieces of Snow White to make a short that would come after Snow White. But the problem is that they were on the cutting board for a reason. They were like the most boring parts of the movie. And so when you put them all together, they're not really that interesting. Ultimately, this goes on to not be released. However, I will tell you that they mentioned the soup scene. Music in Your Soup is a song that got written for it. And fun fact for you Disney goers, if you're in the queue for Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, you can hear an instrumental version of Music in Your Soup. Unused Fantasia segments. I don't have a lot for this. You might already imagine that there were sections of Fantasia that didn't get used. Actually, the plan for Fantasia was that it would constantly be updated, that they would continue to make more sequences, and then they would rotate the sequences in so that when you went to see Fantasia, you would see different versions of the film over time. And so a few of the pieces that were developed were Ride of the Valkyries, the poem Swan of Tuonela. I liked this note on that one. This was based on Finnish legend that told of souls being guided toward heaven by a white swan. But Walt didn't want the swan. He wanted to keep the atmosphere. So it was just going to have a boat bearing a corpse floating through reeds. There was Adventures in a Perambulator, which was a baby's perspective of a day at a park, Invitation to the Waltz, Baby Ballet, Flight of the Bumblebee. Now, Flight of the Bumblebee would actually go on to have an alternate jazzier version, appear in Melody Time as the Bumble Boogie segment, Schwanda the Bagpiper, and then Destino, which was a collaboration between Salvador Dali and Walt Disney. So ultimately, Fantasia didn't do very well. They had to move on, but these got a lot of work done on them. Next up, we have Where the Wild Things Are. Well, fun fact for you, and Max said, "Let the wild rumpus start," is in my high school yearbook as a quote. Where the Wild Things Are, of course, by Maurice Sendak. Disney actually had the rights for a movie in the 80s, but ultimately they were really struggling to expand the story into a feature-length film, and it never got made. But this animation test that I'm about to show you was aired on the Disney Channel.
Now, let's take a look at the test for Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, which was directed by John Lasseter.
So obviously this would not go on to be made. Yes, ultimately there is a live action version of Where the Wild Things Are. Disney did not develop it. Next up, we have American Dog. Now, American Dog was due to be released in 2007, but ultimately this got reworked and many, many concepts later became Bolt. But I will say, I have to read this quote to you that I think will help you understand the difference. Somewhere along the way, the plot had also come to include a radioactive cookie-selling Girl Scout zombie serial killer, which, while we prided ourselves on always remaining open to new ideas, seemed a tad dark for a family film. Despite our misgivings, though, we decided to give the movie a chance to evolve. But after 10 months of story trust meetings and very little improvement, we concluded that the only option was to restart the project. Clearly a little different than Bolt. And then our final one for this layer, we have Mort. Mort was going to be based on Terry Pratchett's Discworld novel of the same name. Perhaps you're familiar with Terry Pratchett and the Discworld series. This is about where Death takes on a human apprentice, and then the human apprentice falls in love with Death's adopted daughter. This doesn't move forward because reportedly the Discworld rights were being sold as a full package. Terry Pratchett didn't want to break up the books, he wanted to sell all of Discworld, and Disney was unwilling to option the full franchise, so the project got killed. We move on to the next layer. And to kick off our next layer is the Little Broomstick. Now, maybe you know the Little Broomstick, but Disney initially was exploring this tale centered on a little girl, Mary, who was led by a black cat, Tib, to discover a magical broomstick that took her to Indoor College, a dark and scary training ground for witches. This is based on a 1971 novel by the same name by Mary Stewart. It was meant to be released in 1980. However, it's not totally clear why it was canceled. There are some speculations that the story felt a little close to home to like Bedknobs and Broomsticks, or that they wanted the animators to focus on other projects like The Black Cauldron. But ultimately, if you are interested in this story, I have great news, because Japanese Studio Ponok would eventually release this in conjunction with Toho. I have the Seven Dwarfs. We're talking a little bit about Snow White today, and this is my favorite part of the story. In 2005, Disney Toon Studio. Now, you may know Disney Toon Studio. Mostly they made direct-to-video Disney movies, right? Maybe their most popular one being the Goofy movie. So 2005, Disney Toon Studio commences work on a movie called The Seven Dwarfs. This was meant to be a computer-animated prequel to Snow White. And the director on it was Mike Disa. You know, I don't know how much of this is Mike Disa's own personal perspective and how much of it was Disney's perspective. So I'm just going to tell you what was said and you enjoy that, which was that Mike Disa, quote, envisioned the film as Disney Toon's answer to The Lord of the Rings. You know how when you look at The Lord of the Rings and you think, I'm sure a Disney Toon movie can compete with that. It was going to explore the history of the Seven Dwarves, their culture, where they come from, and put them on an epic quest. This was going to focus mostly on Dopey and Grumpy, and I will say that he wanted to connect to Snow White by answering a few key questions that I'm sure many of you all are asking yourselves about Snow White. Number one, why do the dwarves live alone in the woods? Number two, why do they seem to know the witch? Number three, why is the witch afraid to confront the dwarves? And number four, who is that skeleton in the dungeon reaching for the water? I once again have a little teaser for you here.
All right, Dopey. It says right here that you talk in our new movie. See? You got all the best lines. You got to talk. Darn it, you're not wrecking my big comeback. I'll get you to talk. Just read the card, you dopey dwarf. Yay, Dopey! Give me a D. Yeah, this might be the problem here. You got a frog in your throat.
Oh.
Talk, damn ya! The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. Bernie, I'm a professional. I can't works like this. Say hello when you pick up the phone, you idiot. Oh, please, 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 please. Why, yes, Mr. Grumpy. I would love to speak in our new film. Fine, don't talk. See if I care.
So there you go. Now you've seen it. All right. So execs afterwards pushed Disa to change the story. Instead of epic quest to answer these questions I talked about, now they wanted them to make it more of a Dopey story, explaining where he got so emotionally scarred that he lost the ability to talk. My favorite part of the story was, and you know, I am biased because I do work in the video game industry. Anticipating consumer demand, Disney hired video game developer Obsidian Entertainment to create a video game for the Seven Dwarfs movie. This game was to be a prequel to the prequel, focusing on the ancestors of the dwarves. And we are so lucky to have heard directly from Kevin Saunders, who was lead designer of the project and a producer at Obsidian. Kevin wrote the game's outline, and then he described the following sequence. You, as a teenage prince, awake in your bed to haunting sounds. Exploring the dark castle, you come across a terrifying, shadowy creature that you kill in a desperate struggle. Its cries shifting from a supernatural shriek to that of a human woman's blood-curdling cry of death. The illusion is then dispelled, and your mother, the queen, lays dead before you, the bloody knife that killed her in your hand. What? You know how when you want to make a Disney video game? So anyway, this project gets killed in 2006. Disney purchased Pixar last year, becomes in charge of the Toon Studio projects, and he eliminates it. I'm just so disappointed that we didn't get that video game. Okay, The Graveyard Book. The Graveyard Book was meant to be based on the Neil Gaiman novel of the same name. It was actually, sort of interestingly enough, meant to be a stop motion project from Pixar, which was going to be the first stop motion project that Pixar had ever done. And it was going to be the only adaptation Pixar had ever done. Henry Selick, who you may know from working on Nightmare Before Christmas, but also directing Coraline. After Coraline was super successful, got recruited by Pixar to work on some films, including The Graveyard Project. But he worked on the movie for about 18 months and then abandoned the project for, quote, unknown reasons. I'm going to tell you, I think we're about to find out the reason in our next entry. Disney still has the rights to make The Graveyard Book into a movie, and Gaiman has said that about every 18 months, Disney tells him that they have a new writer on it, and then it doesn't actually move forward. So he doesn't really expect that it's ever going to actually happen, but theoretically, this could happen, maybe. Now, the Shadow King. The Shadow King was originally named Shademaker, and it is my belief that it's the reason the last movie didn't happen, because The Shadow King was written by Henry Selick. This is happening around the same time as the Graveyard Book adaptation. So Coraline comes out, I believe, 2009. This film began pre-production in 2011 with an expected release of 2013. We have lots of footage on this. You know, it's got that clear, like, kind of Coraline-y look to it, right? This is about Hapdagger. It's a 9-year-old orphan that hides his fantastically weird hands from the cruel world. There they are, the weird hands. When a living shadow girl teaches him to make amazing hand shadows, his hands become weapons in a shadow war against a ravenous monster who could destroy Hap's brother and all of New York. So we have a very clear kind of like Coraline-y, Tim Burton-y look to this. And Henry Selick has said this, that Pixar has their brain trust. They rip things apart. They rebuild. They rip things apart. They rebuild. And they just really couldn't support his vision for the film. He thought that he could make it better, and they kept changing and they changing and they changing. Ultimately, it didn't work out. Once it got killed, he said, it's also a huge relief because it's like taking your kid to the playground and watching your kid get beat up every day and then having to take your kid home and wipe the tears away just really wasn't worth it. Because it's his, he had the rights. And so took the movie to the European market in 2013, ultimately didn't get any buyers, but he still believes that maybe there'll be hope for it. If he ever makes it, he'll owe some money to Disney, but it's possible. The Yellow Submarine. In 2009, Disney announced that they wanted to do a motion captured remake of the Yellow Submarine. You know when motion capture films were all the rage, like The Polar Express and Beowulf? This was announced at D23, and the film was slated for a summer of 2012 release, which would have lined up with the 2012 Summer Olympics in London. Allegedly, if this film had been successful, it would have done not just a Broadway musical, but they also would have had a Cirque du Soleil show for it. This was going to be written and directed by Robert Zemeckis. And if you're asking yourselves, well, would they use the Beatles' original recordings and then do motion capture on top of it? No. They're going to recast the Beatles. Peter Serafinowicz was on the line for Paul. Dean Lennox Kelly was John. Cary Elwes was going to be George, and Adam Campbell was going to be Ringo. The motion capture was going to be performed by a Beatles tribute band from California called the Fab Four, and David Tennant was in talks to play the Chief Blue Meanie. Well, maybe, if you say like, well, could it have been good? Could I accept someone else voicing the Beatles in a modern remake of the 1968 Yellow Submarine? And to answer that question, I have this amount of footage, which I think is enough for you to make an educated decision.
What's the matter, John, love? Blue meanies?
Newer and bluer meanies have been sighted in the vicinity of this theatre. There's only one way to go out.
How's that?
Singing!
Singing! I hate this. Luckily for us, after A Christmas Carol and Mars Needs Mom didn't perform, this project got killed. All right, next up, we have Princess Academy. Now, Princess Academy is sort of interesting. This was a canceled 2D animation short, and it was going to contain female heroines from all manner of well-known and obscure Disney and Pixar projects that were interacting together. So this was getting worked on right after Princess and the Frog released, and you can see in this picture, there's all kinds of folks in there, but it's not just really popular characters, it's all number of female heroines from Disney and Pixar past. We don't know a ton about this. We do have this piece of concept art that may be the protagonists of this short. Some have alleged that the Princess Academy might act as some sort of like boarding school for new princesses, but nothing is confirmed. And early on in the project, Alan Menken actually agreed to work on it as long as, and you'll love this, as long as, quote, it would be greenlit by Disney in the future. Unfortunately, in 2013, Disney completely gutted their hand-drawn animation studios, and it killed the project. And our last entry on this layer is Sweating Bullets. Sweating Bullets is the early version of Home on the Range. Disney classic Home on the Range? Originally, this started as a supernatural Western about a cowboy that visits a ghost town and confronts an undead cattle hustler named Slim. Then it went on to be a story about a little bull named Bullets who wanted to be more like the horses that led the herd. And then it went on to change and have like bounty hunter stuff, and it would go on to be Home on the Range. And that brings us to our next layer with a film project by the name of Wildlife. Wildlife is loosely based on Pygmalion, and it was very heavily inspired by 1970s pop culture. It was meant to have references to like Warhol and Anna Wintour and more. Red Pitsane on the right and Kitty Glitter on the left. And these two have a nightclub called Club Wildlife. And Club Wildlife starts struggling because Kitty Glitter starts losing some popularity, and everyone starts going to their competitor, Magda's club. This is Magda. And so Red Pitsane, I really want that name to be Pitstain, and it's not, it's Pitsane. Red and Kitty are really desperately looking for something to help them compete with Magda's club when they find a talking elephant. This is Ella. Ella is an elephant. They didn't really reach for that name. Ella is an elephant that can talk. And then Ella, who they bring to their nightclub, is fixing a neon sign when she gets electrocuted and believes from being electrocuted, Ella believes she's a pop star. So here is Ella as a pop star. Now, Ella becomes very popular, and this drives a bunch of popularity back to Red and Kitty's nightclub. But eventually, Ella just wants to go back to the zoo. She doesn't want to be famous anymore. Also, Kitty thinks that Red is seducing Ella, and Kitty gets jealous. But actually, that's not happening. Red loves Kitty, and they end up together. I have this for you, which is, an animation test of some kind. This is from Wildlife, giving you an idea of the vibes, the club. There you go. Now, Roy Disney, who was then vice chairman of the board, he didn't like this movie because of the mature humor. And I have to read this to you because it made me laugh out loud. Roy Disney, then vice chairman of the board, said he was appalled at the mature humor, particularly one joke where two gay characters are about to enter the sewers and one says to the other, "You ever been down a manhole before?" And I think that's funny. That's funny. Roy didn't agree. So ultimately this project got killed. However, we're back. We're back to the rejected inventions room. Because earlier I saw somebody when I showed this say, Who's that pig on the left? It's not a pig. That's an elephant. And this is Ella. All right, next we have Alice in Wonderland, 1933 and 1939. Now, eventually, obviously, the feature animated version of Alice in Wonderland would come out in the 50s, but this was originally explored to be a live action film adaptation of Alice in Wonderland in 1933, and Mary Pickford was cast as Alice. Now, a little fun fact that I learned is that Mary Pickford was the co-founder of the studio United Artists and was one of the original 36 founders of the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences. So this was meant to be the first feature-length film production that Disney did, but I was so confused doing research on this because I would search Alice in Wonderland 1933, and there is a movie that came out, Alice in Wonderland in 1933, and I was like, wait, but what? So Paramount actually did release a live action Alice in Wonderland film in 1933, and because it got released, Disney canceled this project. Then they came back to it in 1939. Disney created a draft of Alice as a full-length animated feature, but the draft was ultimately turned down and retooled when they eventually released it as a much lighter, more modern approach with the final film. But boy, are these concepts stunning. They are so beautiful. Next up, we have The Life of Hans Christian Andersen. This was a 1940s biographical film based on the life of Hans Christian Andersen, and it was going to mix live action portions about his life as well as animated portions that depicted the fairy tales that he is known for. But despite his enthusiasm to tell this story, Walt Disney got preoccupied with war films, killed the project. Then we got Catfish Bend. Catfish Bend is a 1970s exploration where Disney greenlit an adaptation of Catfish Bend from the book series by Ben Lucian Berman. This was going to feature stories about various animals that were living along the banks of the Mississippi River. So this is another book adaptation, lots of source material. Ultimately just didn't come to fruition. Really pretty concept art though. Then we have Ghostopolis. Ghostopolis was going to be based on the graphic novel by the same name. If you're not familiar, this is about a man who works for the government's supernatural immigration task force with the job to send ghosts that have come into our world. The agent is responsible for sending them back to the ghost world. And then a living child gets somehow into the ghost world, and the agent has to go and save the living child from the ghost world. He does this by meeting up with a ghost who was like a former flame of his, and they save the boy together. Fun fact about this movie, Hugh Jackman was attached to play the agent. And then finally, we have Cosmic 3000. Cosmic 3000 was a planned computer animated sci-fi movie. The development of this began in 2010 or 2011, and the film was then scrapped. It's not clear why, but we do have some cool concept art for it, like this one, as well as some cool character concepts here. And then, can I pet that dog? Can I pet that dog? What a cutie. All right, next up we have Chanticleer, a name you may be familiar with because, yes, this was based on the play and was to take place on a Parisian farm in the 1800s. Chanticleer is a vain rooster who all the animals in the farm believe that it is his crowing that makes the sun rise. Here are some of those animals. This story was explored in 1943, but it faced trouble because Disney couldn't figure out a way to make Chanticleer sympathetic. He's in the story an incredibly vain character, and they were having a really hard time making the character sympathetic, somebody that you would want to root for. Not a problem that they have with DCOMs. In DCOMs, if they make a character that is unsympathetic, they just ship it. But apparently they didn't want to make this. Walt had an idea actually to combine this with a different project. There was a project called Reynard the Fox, and they were going to combine it, and they were going to make the fox the villain character, which would boost the sympathy for Chanticleer, the rooster character, but it ultimately didn't work out. In 1981, this idea got revived, this time with Chanticleer being depicted as, quote, the most macho chicken in all of France. I don't know that there's a lot of competition for the most macho chicken in all of France, but that hell of a tagline. Unfortunately, they couldn't figure out. Still, they were plagued by how to make this character sympathetic. And you know what? If this sounds any way familiar to you, I will tell you that in 1991, Disney published a children's book that was sort of based on the story treatment that this got called Chanticleer and the Fox. and it used Mark Davis's sketches. And in the same year, Don Bluth, who had worked at Disney and was now directing a rival studio, worked on a movie by the name of Rock-a-Doodle, which you may be familiar with. I certainly am. Now, all this work didn't go to no use. Mark Davis's sketches actually did go on to inspire characters in, number one, Robin Hood, and number two, for you theme park historians out there, America Sings. And then, of course, the characters from America Sings would go on to be in the riverboat scene at the end of Splash Mountain. 1906 was a 2005 Pixar collaboration. This is actually notable for a couple of reasons. Disney, Pixar, and Warner Brothers were all collaborating to make a live-action adaptation of the novel 1906, which is an account of the San Francisco earthquake. It was going to be Pixar's first live-action movie, and two, it was the first time that they had partnered with a major studio that wasn't Disney. They were working with Warner Brothers. Last that's known about this project is that Pixar and Disney have left the project, and Warner Brothers still has the rights, and maybe it's in limbo. And next we have Mickey Columbus. In 1988, Mickey was celebrating his 60th birthday, and there was a desire from Disney to bring Mickey kind of back to the spotlight, to make more Mickey cartoons, and to celebrate Mickey a little bit more, so that people would, I guess, know Mickey Mouse more. The first of these you may have seen, The Prince and the Pauper, comes out in 1990. The plan was to do this every 2 years. Every 2 years there'd be a Mickey short, and The Prince and the Pauper was the first one. 1992 was the plan for the next one, which also happens to be the 500th anniversary of the voyage of Christopher Columbus. So Disney decides, hey, the next movie, the 1992 movie, should be a short to commemorate the journey of Christopher Columbus, with Mickey playing the role of Columbus and King Ferdinand actually being played by Pete. This is from a sequence in the film where Mickey was going to have a nightmare that King Ferdinand, Pete, was like coming after him. Now, this movie got shelved for two reasons. One is that the company wanted to use its animators to invest in full-length feature films. So they wanted to invest in like Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast, right? And they wanted to take all their resources and pour them into the Disney Renaissance, which they had kind of just kicked off. But also they knew that, quote, Mickey, Donald, and Goofy would inevitably have to encounter Native Americans. And they didn't want to do a Peter Pan repeat and be super offensive. What I think is really funny about this to me is that Disney's like, nah, I can't think of any way we can depict Native Americans that isn't offensive. I can't think of a single way. I mean, if we're gonna put them in the movie, it has to be offensive. So I guess we just can't do the project. So ultimately, Mickey Columbus doesn't happen. All right, on to Musicana. Musicana was meant to be a new version of Fantasia. Mel Shaw returns to the Disney studio in the 70s and starts exploring a new version of Fantasia called Musicana. And this was gonna be another series of shorts set to music. Each one of the shorts was going to be set in a different country with a different story, and it was going to use music from each of those countries. By the Bayou was going to be jazz music set in the Deep South, featuring music from Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. Heavy frog feature here. There's a South American piece that was going to use a lot of Aztec and Incan mythology with a song by Peruvian soprano Ima Sumac. There was the Rain God that was set in Africa and telling the story of a monkey that steals a diamond from the Rain God. There was the Emperor and the Nightingale, which was based on the story of the Nightingale and was to feature Mickey as a servant to the Emperor of China. This was like similar to his role in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where he was like servant to Yen Sid. And then there's Finlandia, which was set in Scandinavia, about an ice god and a sun goddess doing battles. Also, finally, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, which was going to feature anthropomorphic birds telling the story from 1001 Nights, set to Scheherazade. This project eventually gets passed on because they were concerned about the commercial viability. Fantasia had not done well at all when it got released, although some see Musicana as sort of the starting point that eventually leads to Fantasia 2000 happening. Treasure Planet 2. This what's interesting about this story is that this sequel was in works prior to Treasure Planet releasing. They're in development of Treasure Planet. Most of the original cast was expected to return. Willem Dafoe was cast as the voice of the villain, and Treasure Planet comes out, it's released, and on a Monday after it comes out, around Thanksgiving, so Treasure Planet comes out late November, on a Monday after it comes out, the team is at a recording studio waiting on Defoe to show up. And instead, they got a call that the project was canceled because Treasure Planet 1 tanked at the box office. I mean, bold of them to start working on it ahead of time. Penelope in the 12 Months. Penelope in the 12 Months was based on a poem. The writers of this project had written a poem by the same name. And this was going to be about a girl named Penelope who was going to use a magical grandfather clock to travel throughout the 12 months of the year. And along the way, she was going to interact with some like supernatural beings. Some of those being like leprechauns, right? But then others being like personified versions of months of the year. So in this image, you can see January, December, and April, and also Mother Nature. Mother Nature had with her elements, and these are some of the elements that Mother Nature would have with her. Preliminary sketches of this work were done by Mary Blair, obviously a Disney legend, iconic art style. And actually, when the project got shelved, Mary Blair went back and tried to rework it to try to make it work, but ultimately it got canceled. And finally, we have Morgan's Ghost, the last of this layer. Morgan's Ghost was an unreleased cartoon from around 1939. It was going to be a Mickey, Donald, Goofy cartoon. It was actually going to be the first feature film to star Mickey, Donald, Goofy, because the next one that's going to come out was going to be Fun and Fancy Free. This was going to be a pirate themed story, and it actually later, the story of this got adapted into a comic called Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold, which was the same story, but they replaced Mickey and Goofy with Huey, Dewey, and Louie. Oh, sorry, we're not done. We have Gremlins. Oh man, and Gremlins is so good. This is so fascinating. Gremlins actually came from Roald Dahl. So in the 1940s, Roald Dahl, famed writer, who you know for like Willy Wonka and the BFG, was serving in Washington in the Royal Air Force. The Royal Air Force had presence as a way of sort of like propaganda, kind of, but they were trying to keep the US interested in Britain's war efforts. So Roald Dahl is in Washington, and he had written about his experiences in the Royal Air Force, including a story called Gremlin Lore about mythical gremlins who were like basically causing problems in the planes, right? They sabotaged RAF planes. Since he was serving, he was required to take anything he wrote and submit it to the British Information Services so they could see what he was writing about, that he wasn't like giving away secrets or whatever. And the officer that read his thing passed it along to Disney. Disney was looking for war-related stories to develop his films. So they passed along Gremlin Lore to Walt Disney, and Walt Disney liked it. And so Roald Dahl actually gets leave to go to Burbank to meet Walt. While he's there, he persuades Disney to produce an illustrated book version of the story in anticipation of a film being created. So they make this, The Gremlins, by Flight Lieutenant Roald Dahl. But the movie is never going to see the light of day, partially because since Dahl was enlisted, the Royal Air Force had some ownership over it and got to have like script approval. And that was a pain in the ass, especially for Disney. But also because maybe Roald Dahl stole this? ? While they're working on the movie, Walt receives a letter from a man by the name of Douglas Bisgood, who also was in the Air Force and who claims that he told Roald Dahl all these stories about the Gremlins that he had created. Now, let me be clear. The idea of Gremlins was pretty ubiquitous, but Bisgood had like named them all these things that were like family names and was reportedly working on a book using all of the names that he had given the Gremlins. And he told Dahl all these stories while they were serving together. And Dahl had just written them down, ? And so he sends Walt a letter and is like, hey, by the way, all that stuff that you're making, that's mine. And like, I'm not really saying don't make it. I'm just saying I'd like credit for it. I'm not really interested in the money. He actually writes, I hope it does great. I just want name credit. Walt immediately gives Dahl the benefit of the doubt. He actually writes Roald Dahl and is like, hey, I got this crazy ass letter. I'm sure it's not a big deal, but like, what the? And Dahl's like, oh yeah, that guy, he told me a lot of stuff. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I'm sure when he finds out what we're doing with the money, he won't cause a stink, because the proceeds of the film were actually going to go to the benevolent fund of the Royal Air Force. It was actually going to basically go to like a charitable cause. So listen, maybe Bisgood wrote it, maybe he didn't, who knows? The film wasn't made. It didn't get made, so there was no additional trouble. I will say though, the Gremlins would go on to appear in Epic Mickey. This character on the left in the red is Gremlin Gus, who first appeared in the book. So if you've played Epic Mickey, 1 or 2, the Gremlins are in it. What a crazy story. Okay, now we're on to the next layer, starting with Hiawatha. Again, you may be like, oh, Max, they made that. If you're not familiar, the Song of Hiawatha is a famous 1855 epic poem, and Disney did, in fact, produce a silly symphony called Little Hiawatha about this child, and it had no connection to the poem at all. They just wanted name recognition. They knew that people knew the poem, and so they just wanted to name it that so that people would think it was connected. So Disney actually always wanted to do something with the poem. Walt always thought that there was something here. They even did some concept work, but the project was considered to be really risky for the timeline. Number one was because this was post-World War II, and the studio had not financially recovered. They had lost a ton of money. They were not in a good place. And a lot of folks at the studio were calling this project too, quote, like highbrow. They were comparing it to Fantasia, which had not done well. And so they ultimately decided to use their resources and focus on Cinderella, which of course did work out for the studio. Most people believe that Walt abandoned this by 1949, but you can actually see press articles about it as late as 1951. Lost Prospectors. Lost Prospectors was going to be an unproduced animated short that was going to be released in 1938, featuring Donald and Gus Goose as prospectors lost in Death Valley. Similarly, Ajax the Stool Pigeon was going to be a short that was to feature a bird performing as a military carrier pigeon despite having a fear of heights. Then we have Swabbies. This was meant to be released in 1989. It is a more modern version, and it was the second in a series of shorts meant to bring the classic Disney characters in the spotlight. Remember earlier when we were talking about Mickey Columbus, I was like, they wanted Mickey to be popular again, right? And so there must have been a feeling in the late 80s, early 90s that was like, nobody cares about the Disney characters, right? Because they're trying to drum up interest and bring them back into the spotlight. And this was meant to be released in 1989. It was basically a retread of Bill Murray's Stripes. So in 1981, Stripes comes out. 1989, this is planned to release. It was going to be that like Mickey, Donald, and Goofy go into the Navy. So this is a production character sheet for who's in it, but it was basically a retread of Stripes. Then we have Mountain Carvers, which was a short that was not made, where Mickey, Donald, and Goofy thought it would be cool to, this is unclear to me from what I've read, either recreate Mount Rushmore or carve their heads into Mount Rushmore. I'm not clear on which one of those it is, but it's one of them. And then finally, we have Spring Cleaning. Spring Cleaning was, once again, an unproduced animated short, and this was supposed to have been a return appearance for a character by the name of Bobo the Elephant. If you are not familiar with Bobo, Bobo originally appeared in a short called Mickey's Elephant and was actually meant to be a recurring character. They had plans for Bobo to continue to show up as Mickey's Elephant, but the only other known time when Bobo is going to appear was in the unreleased short Spring Cleaning. And finally, our final layer kicks off with Hootsie the Owl. Here's Hootsie. Hootsie is an unproduced short about an owl named Hootsie that was hatched during the day. And because the owl was hatched during the day, it developed a habit of sleeping through the night, which of course owls don't do. Due to Hootsie's abnormal sleep schedule, I just need to pause. This feels pretty judgmental, what I'm about to say. And as somebody that has an abnormal sleep schedule, I feel a little called out. So because of Hootsie's abnormal sleep schedule, he becomes a constant embarrassment to his parents, and he doesn't have any friends. A slithery snake, seeing Hootsie's loneliness and vulnerability, takes advantage of the horrific way that Hootsie is being treated and tricks Hootsie into helping him steal the eggs of all the other owls. Luckily, Hootsie realizes the snake's nefarious ploys and stays up all night protecting the eggs. Now, why does he need to stay up all night protecting it when theoretically all the other owls should be awake? I don't know. And then the moral of the story is, because he did that, he goes back home and in the morning is so tired that he falls asleep, and he adjusts his sleep schedule so his parents love him. So the moral of the story, I think, is that if there's something about you that makes you different and that it makes it where people judge you, just change that thing, and then you too will be happy. Next up, we have the Donald-Scrooge Opus. This was an unproduced Donald Duck short, notable because Scrooge McDuck was quite popular in comics at the time, but had not appeared in an animated feature. And this was meant to be Scrooge's introduction to animation, but it was never used. And Disney then, shortly after this, turned to concentrating on television shows, which is, of course, Scrooge would go on to appear heavily in some television shows. Next, we have Joe Jump. Some of you all may know about Joe Jump. Was the origins of Wreck-It Ralph. This was developed in early 2000s, and it was going to be about an 8-bit video game character that was going to, much like Wreck-It Ralph, not be very resonant anymore and escape the video game. But that's him on the left. It definitely doesn't look like Wreck-It Ralph. That's Joe Jump on the left. And then this is another character on the right. That is Smash Caliber, which is just a sick-ass name. This was, like I said, developed in the early 2000s. Ultimately, it gets shelved, and then the concept, not really the characters, but the concept gets retooled into 2012's Wreck-It Ralph. And then finally, I get the joy of sharing with you Square World. Square World, Square World, Square World. Square World is weird, man, and I really am excited to tell you about it. It's mostly weird because of why we know so much about it. So Square World was meant to be a 1940s short. And the concept of it is that there was a new machine that was able to make everything square, including people and animals, and there was an evil government that was using it for their own wealth. Now, I want to say those two lines back to back for you again and see if you make any connections here. This is a 1940s short about a machine meant to make everything square, and an evil government is using it for their own wealth. Now, the weird thing about this story is that this doesn't come out. We never see Square World, but I have like a weird amount of information to share with you, because in the 40s, they just took all these ideas that they wanted to put out and they put them in a children's book. The children's book was called The Surprise Package, and it exists. And in the surprise package, they put a bunch of ideas that they thought they were going to make. And in that book, they included Square World. Now remember, I'm gonna show you art, and I'm gonna read to you things that were in the book, starting with this picture. And again, I'm gonna read to you things that were in the book. I do not like so many shapes, he growled. My shape is the right shape. All other shapes are wrong. I do command that henceforth everyone be shaped like me, and that means square. Ha ha, he chuckled with horrid glee. With yardsticks and tape, the soldiers of the Highty-Tighty rushed forth to measure all of the people's shapes. Those who were square, they stamped okay, but anyone who was tall or had a figure like a ball was promptly taken to jail. At length, the great task was done. Life itself now seemed completely square. Each family breakfasted on square poached eggs, square sausages, and square pancakes. When each square father went off to square work, he gave his wife a sad square kiss and strode off, blowing square smoke rings from the end of his square cigar. When the square children went off to square school, they rode on a square bus that bumped along on 4 square wheels. And when people met their friends along the street, they didn't bow or shake hands, they sighed and hailed them with the sign of a square. At last, bragged the Highty-Tighty, I've changed the shape of everything there is. Now I must change the shape of everything that is to be. I must be sure that when I die, my people will still be shaped like me. I do declare that henceforth all newborn babies must be square. Tomorrow, let all the tiny newborn square tots be wheeled beneath my balcony. This is in a kid's book. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that the book ends with but that didn't happen. And the babies were born different. And that was great. And we love different people. And this was obviously a very satirical view on the Nazi regime. And it ends on a happy note of not everything's going to be square and it's better for that. And yeah, that's fine. But this whole thing was in a kid's book. And is that not the most insane you've ever heard? Maybe not. Earlier, I told you that we were going to send cartoons to fight the Nazis because they couldn't be hurt by bullets, but were sad that they were too busy entertaining people. What in the is happening in the 40s? So anyway, that's the ending note of the Iceberg. I have to end there because I don't know how else to end. Actually, I'm not going to end on that, chat. I won't end on that. I instead will end on this.
And blue meters have been sighted in the vicinity of this theater. There's only one way to go out.
How's that?
Singing!